The Autistic Radio Conference Tour 2025 is a co-production with Bild, the Restraint Reduction Network, and Autistic Association. We are open to co-productions with professional organisations where our ethics and interests coincide and align. This short series of short podcasts demonstrate cooperations that are possible, recordings with people at the conference, speaking openly, clearly, with equity in the communication. This isn't a normal conversation. This is a constructed conversation. Everything you say will be edited. Normally in a conversation, you say something out loud and then you try and modify it as you go along. Here, what you do is you say something, you think about what you say, you stop, and you say, no, I shouldn't have said that. I'll say something different. And we do that instead.
Okay.
It's complete control over what you're saying. Would you mind introducing yourself, saying what your name is and your organisation?
Hi, I'm Dave O'Brien. I'm co-chair of the Restraint Reduction Network, along with my colleague, Bengi O'Reilly.
If there was anything you wanted people to go away from this conference with as a priority, what would it be?
It's a great question. Generally, the people that come to the conference are already inquisitive and they are looking for change and they want to be part of that change. So we're not convincing people in the conference to reduce restrictive practice. We're actually seeing that people that come in are wanting to understand how. So if they could go away with one thing, it would be one idea that they can use back where they work to reduce the restrictive practices.
What are restrictive practices? For the listener who don't know that term, what does that mean for you?
Again, a great question. So restrictive practices are best defined as something that happens to another person that stops them doing what they want or makes them do something they don't want to do. Now, that can be quite subtle, the locking of a door, or restricting access to outside space, or it can be more obvious, like physical restraint with people holding parts of another person's limbs.
I have felt very welcome here as an autistic person at your conference. Is that a purposeful thing from the organisation to make people like me who otherwise might seem a bit scary as protesting advocates to include us?
Absolutely. One of the things that the RRN has as a core aspiration and mission is to ensure that people with lived experience have every opportunity to be part of the conversation about how to reduce restrictive practice. That includes attendance at conferences, webinars, events, but also to be part of a network of members who are driving to reduce restrictive practice. And you have to find adjustments that work for people in a way that's unique to them. That might include providing quiet space. That might include providing accessible information. But it also includes that kind of emotional support. Restrictive practice is a particularly traumatic experience. And if we have people here who have experienced it or know someone who's experienced it, we recognize that sometimes these kind of events can trigger memories. And it's important that as an organization, we support people through that process. But also there will be people with lived experience, people who are neurodiverse, people with a learning disability who don't know what restrictive practices are. They've never experienced them or they've never seen them. And we need to make sure we can get that message across in a way that they can understand.
It's very interesting, and I thank you for that. I'm sure the listener out there will feel as though somebody's working on their behalf. That's a lovely thing to hear from the professional group here. And if I could bring up the thorny subject of behaviorism and PBS, positive behavioral support, many people out there in autism land have a very clear negative expectation of anything based on behaviorism. So how does behaviorism inform the practice of reducing these restrictive practices?
This was a big debate in yesterday's conference, and if you ever get a chance to watch the panel discussions, you will be aware of the debate that was held around reducing or eliminating restrictive practice. And one of the conclusions I came away with was that behavior is how human beings navigate the world. Behavior is how we respond to the world around us. So for some people, that behavior is highly functional. And what you can't be doing is taking away a functional behavior that allows an individual to navigate a complex, high arousal, ever-shifting world and not replace it with anything. And I think what we have to be really clear is that PBS in particular is not about changing behavior. It's about providing people with opportunities to adopt behaviors that do not isolate them, do not impact on their quality of life, and keep themselves safe. And it's offering alternatives. It's offering a model of care that is driven by the individual rather than a behavioral approach that's trying to eliminate certain types of behavior.
Would it be fair to say that you are trying to, as an organization, distance yourself from a history of the application of behavioral science, when the application of that behavioral science was to modify people's behavior?
I don't have a lot of experience of using anything other than PBS. So I can't really comment on that applied behavioral analysis and that behavior modification. What I can say is I've been a nurse for 30 odd years. I've seen the world of behavior support transform over those 30 years. And I believe that what shapes behavior support now is the human rights approach, the humanistic approach, and the person-centeredness. That we shouldn't be doing anything to people, we should be doing it with them. And it is very much within the control and the decisions of individuals on how and what they want to do. And we live in a world now where that is far more ingrained in the care and support system than it was 30 years ago. One of the things we have to recognize is that the system of care and support isn't very good at accepting unpredictability. And I was talking to some colleagues at the conference, and we were talking about behavioral unpredictability in people, in human beings. And that exists whether you have a learning disability, whether you are neurodiverse, or you don't. And our behaviors can be unpredictable. They will often be influenced by the environments we're in and the circumstances we're experiencing. And for some people, their behavior causes concern. And I see restrictive practices being brought in partly to reduce that unpredictability, manage the risks, and to keep people safe. And there's nothing wrong with that approach. We want to keep people safe, even from themselves. However, when we normalize something like restrictive practice as part and parcel of somebody's day-to-day care, it becomes not about keeping people safe, but about reducing the unpredictability of behavior. And that level of control can become abusive. And we've seen examples after examples, Wharton Hall, Winterbourne View, where the culture of normalizing restraint led to abuse. Vast majority of people I work with, the use of a restrictive practice is a necessary intervention to keep people safe, and it is done with compassion and support. But sometimes it doesn't. And it is that part of the restraint reduction that we need to eliminate. So the debate about whether we ever live in a world where there is no restrictive practice is a great debate, because it asks fundamental questions about the purpose of restrictive practice. And we have to be very careful. It must be lawful, it must be proportionate to the risk you're managing, and it must be time limited. We stick to those rules, and we will see restrictive practice being used as an exception rather than a rule.
I had a conversation with one of your delegates, a lady who did not identify as neurodivergent, but who had been the equivalent of sectioned, held in a unit against their will, to some extent. But the lady told a story about her being unable herself to regulate everything in her life, and she recognized that there was an instant when, while she was medicated, she left the facility because they had an open door. And she traveled by train and bus and then walking to her home to escape an environment that, in the state she was making her feel that she needed to escape. And then she had something interesting to me. She said she should have been stopped because she had no recollection of the journey. And in hindsight, having come through and got to a stable place in her mind and her brain later on, she saw how vulnerable she was. And she advocated for some kind of restriction, the restriction of keeping her in place. And it sounds to me as though you have a really difficult balance here to cope with, because you are damned if you do and damned if you don't. How does the profession deal with this difficult balance?
It's not easy, but if it was, then you wouldn't need highly skilled and experienced people to be involved in the decision making about when to use the Mental Health Act. And there are a couple of features that is helpful to recognize. And it sounds like this conversation with this lady, she lacked insight at the time of her crisis to understand what was happening to her and the risks that she was putting herself in. And it sounds to me that that understanding only came after she'd received some care and treatment. Now, that's a key point in a person's journey. So when a person is in crisis, and that is driven by a mental health need, insight isn't always there, not exclusively. For some people, they still have insight and they know what they want and they are making decisions. Unwise that they are still their decisions, and they have the right in this country under the Mental Capacity Act to make unwise decisions. And that can be about lifestyle. In those circumstances, it's our role to offer them insight and understanding of the consequences of those decisions. But ultimately, in this country, it is an adult's right to make decisions even if they're unwise. What changes is when there is something happening, and for the want of a better word, we'll refer to it as a mental illness, that is impacting on their decision making. And it is that assessment to understand what's driving some of the decision making that's a key and crucial part of what happens next. And for some people, detention under the Mental Health Act has saved their lives. And it sounds to me like this lady you spoke to recognizes that without that intervention, she could have had a very different outcome. And I have met many people who have said, if I hadn't been detained, if I hadn't been taken to hospital against my wishes, I would be dead. And I recognize that as a successful intervention. What isn't successful is when people are detained, and what we hear about in negative situations is when people have been detained and that threshold of a mental disorder that's driving that decision is less clear. And for people with a learning disability, there is research out there, there is evidence that sometimes people are detained and then on review or tribunal, they are released because the threshold is not met. So we may have a system like the Mental Health Act and what will be the new mental health bill in this country, but we also have protections and safeguards built in, including the right for appeal and the right for review and the tribunals, and they're heavily scrutinized. Every health board has a Mental Health Act officer. They have to scrutinize the paperwork, create those assessments, the decisions, and that is a key part of our safeguards around the inappropriate detention of people with a learning disability and mental ill health. Is it foolproof? Nothing ever is, and mistakes will happen. The debate in panel yesterday was fascinating because it tried to answer that very question. Should we be moving to an elimination or just reduction? And there is a consensus amongst many that restrictive practice have a place in the care services that we offer in the UK. And for some people, it will be a defining intervention that keeps somebody safe. Is that it is always used as the last resort, and we need to demonstrate that we have the capability offering support that isn't restrictive, whilst acknowledging that when we do use a restrictive practice, it must be lawfully applied, proportionate to the risk you're managing, and time limited.
Thank you. Either fitting end for what we have here, and I thank you for speaking out on Autistic Radio.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Wonderful.
We speak our words, we listen.
We speak our words, we listen.
We speak our words, we listen.
We speak our words, we listen.